Peter Pan and Wendy, Chapter 10. Many happy returns. It took a good night's rest for everybody to recover from the excitement of the great fight. As the brig now belonged to Peter and his band, having been taken in fair fight, they all put on pirate clothes and started getting their vessel ready to sail. Peter, of course, became captain. Who else could be? Tootles was boatswain, Nibs and John were mate and second mate. The rest were plain ABs. Some of the crew wanted to keep the Jolly Roger a pirate craft. Some, again, thought honesty was the best policy. What Peter intended nobody knew, and nobody dared ask, for he was not only wearing Hook's suits, altered by Wendy to fit him, but putting on a very good imitation of Hook's manner, hooking his forefinger to look like a claw and sticking the 2-cigar holder in his mouth. He gave orders to head the ship for the Azores. Once there, it would be quicker to fly the rest of the way. It was therefore supposed by the crew that Peter was taking the little darlings home again. But no such plans were in his head. He was growing as cunning as Hook himself. Meanwhile, all this time, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were hopefully and hopelessly expecting their children's return. Sometimes they hoped like anything, and other times they hadn't a halfpenny's worth of hope left. They kept the 3 little beds aired and the nursery window open. Mrs. Darling never left the house. Everything was ready to welcome the wanderers, and everything was just as it had always been, except that the kennel was absent from the nursery between 9 and 6. This was because, after the children's flight, Mr. Darling took all the blame on himself for having chained up Nana in the yard. He said Nana was far wiser than he, and that they had better change places. So he crawled into the kennel and vowed that he would never leave it until his children came home again. Every morning he was taken in a cab, still in the kennel, to his office. Every evening he was brought back the same way. And in the kennel he stayed as long as he was up. He could not take it into bed with him, there wasn't room, but he went to parties in it and became extremely popular. As for his courtesy to Nana, it was almost painful, but they each felt that what had happened was due to their own faults. Mrs. Darling would say, "If only I had not accepted that invitation to dinner at number 27. Mr. Darling would say, "If only I had not been so fidgety and cross with Nana." And Nana would moan, "If only they had not had a dog like me for a nurse." One evening Mr. Darling came home in the kennel, surrounded by a cheering crowd. He was rather enjoying his punishment. It had made him such a celebrated person. Mrs. Darling and Nana, who had not borne their punishment in public, sat mournfully in the night nursery by the open window. But presently Mrs. Darling went into the day nursery and played Home Sweet Home on the piano so tenderly that Mr. Darling curled up and fell asleep in the kennel. Suddenly 2 people entered at the window, Peter and Tinkerbell. They closed the barred window so that Wendy might think her mother had shut her out and go back to the island with Peter. This sly and hookish plan had been in his head ever since he took command of the ship. But Peter was not so heartless as he made out, and when he saw Mrs. Darling, who was very pretty, shedding tears, and he knew that was because of Wendy, he unbarred the window again and flung it wide. "Come along, Tink," he said. "We don't want any silly blubbing mothers." And away they went, not very far though. Directly after, Wendy, John, and Michael flew in. They were disappointed at finding Mr. Darling asleep in the kennel instead of Nana, still more disappointed that their mother was not standing waiting to welcome them. But when they heard her playing in the next room, they knew she would come in shortly. Each child slipped into its own bed. Mrs. Darling soon returned to the night nursery, and there were the 3 little heads in the 3 little beds, just as she had so often dreamed she saw them. She thought she was dreaming still, and sat down sadly by the fire. Then they all jumped out and ran into her arms. How utterly lovely! Oh, Mummy! Oh, my sweet dears! And Mr. Darling awoke, and Nana hurried in, and everybody was unbelievably happy, except Peter, who stared in at the window and wondered what it felt like to have a real mother after all. He was not exactly envious, but he was a wee bit less cocky than usual, and snubbed Tink when she wanted him to be off. How long had the children been away? That I cannot tell you. You see, they did not bother about dates and months, and there was only the crocodile time to tell them hours. But it was not so short, perhaps, as it seemed to them, and not so long as it seemed to Mrs. Darling. The other boys waited downstairs until they thought the surprises and explanations would be over. They counted up to 500. Then they walked upstairs and stood in a row before Mrs. Darling. They had taken their hats off, but were awkward in their pirate clothes. Mrs. Darling was quite willing, as Wendy had promised, to adopt them. But Mr. Darling thought 6 extra boys rather a lot. However, with careful arrangement of the drawing-room furniture, corners were found for all the boys, without having to enlarge number 14. Mrs. Darling also offered to adopt Peter, who would only converse through the window. But when he learned that he would be sent to school and probably to an office, and would be a man before long, he declined rather roughly. He was so horribly afraid of being caught and made into a grown-up, and perhaps even having a beard. "I shall live with Tink," said he, "in the little house we built for Wendy. The fairies are fixing it high up beside their nests in the treetops." "How lovely!" cried Wendy longingly. "But you will be lonely in the evenings." "Well, can't you come back with me?" "May I, Mother, just for a short time?" "Certainly not," said Mrs. Darling. But Peter looked so downcast that she very nobly offered to let Wendy go for a week every year to the little house to do Peter's spring cleaning. This having been settled, Peter flew away quite gaily. At the end of the first year, he came back to fetch Wendy. She was now the only one who could fly. John and Michael had entirely lost their flying power as time went on. They had to go to school, and then they blamed Wendy bitterly for not letting them stay on the island. Later on, they grew so accustomed to things that they became quite commonplace, ordinary little boys, and entirely forgot their wonderful life in the Neverland. But they were not the only forgetful ones, for when Wendy was talking over old times with Peter, up in the little house in the treetops, she found that his mind was a blank about bygone adventures. He had enjoyed so many new ones in the course of the year. He even asked, "Who is Captain Hook?" And on being reminded how he had killed Hook and saved the lives of all the children, Peter seemed scarcely interested. "I forget people," he said, "after I have killed them." Presently, Tinkerbell being mentioned, he actually inquired, "Who is Tinkerbell?" He could not remember, even after Wendy had explained. He said, "Ugh, there are such a lot of fairies about." Wendy was rather shocked. It looked as if the time would come when Peter would say carelessly, "Who is Wendy?" But she did a great spring cleaning for him all the same. "If he forgets," she told herself. "Anyhow, I never can." Next year he did not come to fetch her. Wendy, grieved and hurt, waited in vain. But the 3rd year he arrived, and did not seem to know he had missed last time. Certainly his memory was getting worse and worse. However, Wendy did not find fault with him. She spring-cleaned again, and it was sweet to sit with Peter in the little house of an evening after the day's work was done. And that was the end of Wendy's visits to the Neverland. For, after this, years and years and years went by without a sign of Peter. The boys all grew up. Michael became an engine driver, and Tootles a judge, and Slightly a lord, and so on. Wendy not only grew up, but married and had a daughter named Jane. Who could have believed it? Mrs. Darling was dead. Nana was dead. Mr. Darling could not have squeezed into the kennel to save his life. There were only 2 people sleeping in the night nursery, Jane and her nurse. Sometimes Wendy put Jane to bed, and then she would tell her long, long stories about Peter Pan. It was difficult to make Jane understand that Wendy could not fly any longer. She loved to listen to the tales about the fairies, the pirates, the redskins, the mermaids, the home under the ground, and the little house. By and by she had heard these adventures so often she knew about them better than her mother. "What was the last thing Peter ever said to you?" Jane asked one evening. "He said, 'You be always waiting for me, and then some night you will hear me crowing.' What was his crow like?" Like this," and Wendy tried to imitate it. But Jane replied gravely, "No, it wasn't. It was like this," and she did a much more lifelike crow. "My darling child, how in the world do you know?" "Oh, I often hear it when I'm asleep." This not only startled Wendy, but made her rather nervous, because Jane was her only child. She took to sitting in the nursery nearly every night, so as to keep an eye on Jane. And one night, as she was darning socks by firelight, the window blew open, and Peter dropped in, just as of old. He had not changed at all, and at first he did not notice that Wendy was now a big woman. "Hello, Wendy," he said, as if he had seen her that afternoon. "Hello, Peter," she replied, hoping he would not stay long, lest Jane should wake. "Have you forgotten," he asked, rather severely, "that this is spring-cleaning time?" It was no use to tell him that he had forgotten some 14 or 15 spring-cleaning times. "I can't come," said Wendy. "I have forgotten how to fly. You can see for yourself." And she turned up the light. Peter saw a tall, beautiful woman, and he gave a cry of pain. "Oh, Wendy, you promised not to grow up." "I couldn't help it, Peter. I grew up several years ago. I am married now." "No, you're not. And that little girl in bed is my baby." "She's not," cried Peter, and he moved towards Jane with his dagger lifted. But instead of stabbing her, he sat down on the floor and sobbed in the most heartbroken manner. Wendy was so distressed that she left the room. She had no notion how to comfort him, and she hated to see him suffer. Presently, Peter's weeping wakened Jane, and she sat up in bed. "Little boy, why are you crying?" He bowed to her, and she bowed to him, just as Wendy had done of old. "My name is Peter Pan," he remarked. "Yes, I know," said Jane. "I was expecting you." When Wendy returned with some cake for Peter, she found him crowing on the bedpost, and Jane flying round the room in her nightie. It was a sight to freeze a loving mother, but Jane was having a perfectly splendid time. Peter bid a hasty goodbye to Wendy, and was just floating through the window with Jane when Wendy caught hold of her child, crying, "No, no!" "I'm only going for spring-cleaning time," said Jane. "He wants me always to do his spring-cleaning, and he does so need a mother. You see, Mummy, you can't fly." She had to let them fly away together. It was bound to happen sooner or later. She had always feared that it would. By now, Jane is herself a grown-up who cannot fly, so she cannot boast over Wendy. And she has a small daughter called Margaret, whom Peter fetches away to the Neverland every spring cleaning time, unless he forgets. Margaret tells him stories, mostly about himself, which she has heard from her mother and her grandmother. They all sound quite new to Peter. And my goodness, doesn't he enjoy them, especially those about himself. Very likely Margaret will grow up and have a daughter who will go and mother Peter, and so on, as far as can be seen. But after all, first come is first served. The happiest days of all were those long ago days in the little house with its 2 inhabitants, just Peter Pan and Wendy. The end.